We're always taught to tell our kids, you can be anything you want to be. You can be president of the United States. You can be the next Super Bowl quarterback. But that's really not true in most cases. But we're also told that you have these limiting factors and these weaknesses, and they're called weaknesses, when they could actually be an attribute that makes you incredibly special and also able to make a very good living if you specialized in that. My guest today, David Rendell, multi-time author, speaks around the globe, is going to talk about strengths, weaknesses, and why weaknesses are not really weaknesses. And in society, we probably have it wrong. This one has gotten me thinking a lot. So I think this will be an introspective one for you as well. Enjoy. I had the pleasure of speaking with David Rendell. And during the last 15 years, he has spoken to audiences on every inhabited continent. His clients also include the U.S. Air Force, the Australian government, and Fortune 50 companies such as Microsoft, AT&T, United Health Group, and State Farm, just to name a few. Before becoming a certified speaking professional, he was a leadership professor, a stand-up comedian, and a nonprofit executive. So we've got a lot to talk about. He also has a doctor of management degree in organizational leadership, as well as a graduate degree in psychology, and is the author of 4 books, one of which is called The Freak Factor, which we'll discuss today. And I read, and I know you guys will dig. So without further ado, welcome to the podcast, David.
Thanks, man. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, my pleasure. My pleasure. So this was fun, a fun podcast to do the research for, because as we very quickly talked before we went live here, a lot of your research, a lot of your findings, and a lot of your writings are somewhat counterintuitive. But before we get there, can you, your bio is crazy because you've done so much. Can you talk about just maybe, how you started? And we don't have to go through the whole journey of how you got to here today, but just what set you on the path towards this?
Yeah. Well, I'll try to be brief with that. When I was 16, I had experienced a pretty severe event. So my best friend of really most of my life, and for a variety of reasons, kind of the only person I'd had a consistent friendship with, because I'd changed schools and we'd moved and just things like that. And he was the only kind of constant in my life. He was killed in a hunting accident. And not only that, but he was killed by a friend of mine. Again, accidentally, but now that person had to deal with what they had done, and his family had to deal with that loss. And I lost a good friend. And in the aftermath of that, it makes you a little more serious as a 16-year-old than you otherwise might be, just hanging out and, enjoying sports and enjoying music and goofing around. And so I developed this idea that I wanted to help people. So when I went to college, I picked psychology because it seemed like a way to help people. And then when I started work, I helped people with disabilities in nonprofits because that seemed like a way to help people. And then along the way, I started, supervising and managing people. And that's what got me to get my doctorate in management leadership, write a book about leadership, and start thinking about that stuff because I was a young person and managing people who were much older than me and wanting to do it well, knowing they didn't want their child to be their boss.
Sure.
And so I went from helping people to managing the people that were helping people. And I still think that's the same kind of thing. And then I really got excited about leadership. And then I had opportunities as a volunteer with like community leadership programs to teach leadership. And then decided I wanted to do that full time. And my family was moving across the country from Wisconsin to North Carolina, parents and brothers and sisters. And so we took that as an opportunity to move and do a career change. So then I went to teaching full time as a college professor. And then I started doing speaking, and I decided I liked that better than teaching. So after 10 years of teaching and building the business, I started doing that. And it's also part of what we're going to talk about today. I kept trying to move towards my strengths. I kept trying to move towards I was best at. I kept trying to move towards what I liked and what's good at. I kept trying to be idealistic and build the ideal life instead of saying this is just the way it has to be, or if it was fun, it wouldn't be called work, or, you just have to do, what you have to do to just get by, and you can't be greedy and hope to enjoy it as well. So part of it was, continuing to learn more about myself and understand more about myself and have a sense of mission, but also have a sense of self-awareness and what's my best way of achieving that message and helping people in the world. And I'll just say one last thing, because I know that was a long answer, but that is the last 30 years of my life. So that's fair to take.
That was pretty concise, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. But last year I had the opportunity to speak at a school for kids with learning differences, K through 12, and, got paid my full keynote fee that I would, get paid for speaking at a big corporate client, to help a bunch of kids with learning differences find out that they're not broken and that they're not the problem and that they can have an amazing life. And that just because the world sometimes sees their weaknesses, it doesn't mean they don't have strengths. And so I'm still helping people. It's just the way has changed, but also the opportunity to help some kids with learning differences. When I started my career helping people with, pretty profound disabilities, helps me to see that I'm on the right path, and I'm just finding new and maybe better, more effective ways to try to make the world a better place and help people have better lives.
Yeah, no, that's full circle.
Yeah,
literally full circle. I love that. I'd love to, if we could, talk about the concept of freak factor. And for those of you that are listening on Spotify or Apple, I'm actually holding up the book from David called The Freak Factor. He has 4. This is just the one I chose to read because I love the content so much. Can you talk about why you wrote that? And let's go ahead and get into that, this practice, the philosophy of, not really a philosophy, but just the learnings that you had around this.
Yeah. It's a pretty simple thing. You mentioned Now Discover Your Strengths before we started. I listened to a lot of audiobooks. One of my top 5 strengths on the Strengths Finder is input. I love to learn. And so I used to have a job. My first job out of college was helping students with disabilities. And I'd ride around listening to books on tape from the library because I was too poor to buy them. And tapes were still the way you listen to things on the go.
Yeah, for sure.
And so I've always been a reader. And then once listening was an option, I've always done that. And now podcasts. And so I was listening to Now Discover Your Strengths. I'd listened to another book where the guy kind of made the point that in the world, in certain circles, we define being a good person as all the qualities women would traditionally have. And we define all the bad characteristics as you could have as all the stereotypically male characteristics. Obviously, there's a lot of movement there, but just, and that a lot of the things that seem like weaknesses that men have are also strengths, and that we miss that sometimes. And then I listened to Strengths Finder, and I'd never heard that. I'd never heard that you should just focus on your strengths. In fact, my upbringing was all about fixing weaknesses. And even if you think you're doing well, you're not, and don't get too proud of yourself, and always be looking for a chance to find another chink in your armor, another Achilles heel that you have. And so that was all new to me. And at the same time, I was volunteering for the Chamber of Commerce and on the board of directors as a way to serve the community and make some connections to help create job opportunities for the people that I was serving, because people aren't excited about hiring people with disabilities. And I knew I needed some relationships to do that. And that required some public speaking. And all of a sudden, people were loving it. People were laughing and having a great time and paying attention. And I was loving it and having a great time getting their attention and communicating with them. And so that was happening at the same time I was learning about this. And I was like, wait a second. It seems like, I was always in trouble growing up because I wouldn't sit still and be quiet and do anything what I was told. And now I was in leadership positions instead of doing what I was told. And I was standing up instead of sitting down. And I was talking instead of being quiet. And I was goofing around and being silly. And it was making people laugh instead of getting me kicked out of class. And so when you take my upbringing, and we didn't talk about that. So growing up, I was always, even into college, in trouble for not sitting still and being quiet and doing what I was told, and told you're hyperactive and you're inappropriate and you're immature and you have no self-control. And if you can't fix this, you're never going to be successful. And then as an adult, I'm learning that you can focus on strengths, which no one ever did in my life, and And then also realizing that maybe something that I thought was the worst things about me, the 3 worst things about me: can't sit still, can't be quiet, can't do what you're told. And all of a sudden people seem to be loving it when I'm standing up, talking and leading. And now eventually, running my own business as a professional speaker. I just had a question. It wasn't fully formed. I was just like, I wonder if a weakness can also be a strength. I wonder if something that looks like your worst quality could be your best quality. And I didn't know the answer, but I started looking into it and found it was definitely true for me. In fact, I have a bunch of weaknesses that are strengths, I think. And then finding a bunch of amazing stories about dyslexic billionaires and a guy with no arms who's got the longest, most accurate shot ever in archery because he doesn't have arms, and he has huge weaknesses that are strengths. And then developed an assessment and now an online personality test that shows everybody how their weaknesses are strengths, and how every characteristic is basically a weakness or a strength depending on the situation you're in and the people that you're around. And so it wasn't like focus group research or marketing. It was happening to me, and it seemed interesting, and I wondered if it might be helpful to other people. And then now here we are 15 years and multiple books later, and speeches all over the world, where it keeps resonating enough with people that people tell other people who tell other people who tell other people. And I just keep talking about it because people keep benefiting from it.
Yeah. You just shared a lot right there. If we can rewind just a hair and really, what is the new thing? Double click. I got to use this one. We got to double click on that's the new vernacular, right? On this. Everyone has weaknesses. You said everyone has weaknesses that are actually their strengths.
Yeah.
And I grew up like you, like, hey, fix your weaknesses, work on the worst part of your game, work on the worst part of your whatever. And then the data started to shift in the 90s, but it's almost like you're the third iteration of this versus just work on your weaknesses versus just focus on your strengths. You're like, embrace your weaknesses because they can be a strength. But if you can unpack that a little bit and explain what you actually mean by that.
Yeah. So 2 things, and I always say this in my speeches, I'm not saying people don't have weaknesses, right? This isn't rose-colored glasses. The weakness isn't there. It's just a development opportunity. That's just other code for fix it. That doesn't make it any better to call it an opportunity. So I'm not saying people don't have weaknesses. I'm not saying there's nothing wrong with your spouse or your partner or your kids or your employees or whatever it happens to be. We all have weaknesses. So I'm not saying that. But I'm also not saying we're turning the weakness into a strength, right? So it's not like, so I couldn't be quiet growing up, and then I fought against it, and I became a counselor and turned my biggest weakness into a strength. And in fact, I have a master's degree in counseling psychology. So despite my efforts, I did not turn it into a strength. Like I did everything I could to be what people said I should be, and I got nothing for that. And then I became a professional speaker, which I have no training or anything else for. It's natural instinct and skill and being entertaining and understanding what gets people's attention. And that's how I make a living. So I'm not saying that we turn weaknesses into strengths. I'm trying to show people that the characteristic that looks like a weakness in front of certain people or in certain situations, or maybe even all of the time, could actually be a strength. So the simplest example of that is we were talking about this before, is if I say, Roger, what's your biggest strength? And you say it's persistence. And I say, great. And I said, what's your biggest weakness? And you go, my spouse and my partner says I'm stubborn, and my kids say I'm stubborn, and my boss says I'm stubborn, and my coworkers say I'm stubborn, and my friends say I'm stubborn. So I guess I'm stubborn. And then, we dig into that a little bit. What's the definition of persistence? It's sticking with things longer than most people think is reasonable. Well, guess what the definition of stubbornness is? It's sticking with things longer than most people think is reasonable, right?
Sure.
And so, in fact, I used to say in my speeches, let's look it up in the dictionary. One of the other examples is like spontaneous and impulsive. I say, let's look it up in the dictionary. But I always just said that, but I didn't ever look it up. But I just said spontaneous, we say, is a positive characteristic. Impulsive, we say, is a negative characteristic. But they both mean to do things without planning or forethought.
Yeah.
But I actually looked it up once. I was on the plane, and finally I was like, I'm going to look up the exact definition. And the definition of spontaneous is to do things impulsively. And the definition of impulsive is to do things spontaneously, right? So all I'm trying to teach people is that we don't have neutral words for characteristics. And so we tend to say, if you're spontaneous and somebody meets you and says, hey, I'm thinking about going out with Roger, and he's really spontaneous, people are going to go, oh, congratulations, you met a nice spontaneous person. And if they say I met Roger and he seems impulsive, people are going to go, be careful.
You're right.
So
Right.
back to persistence and stubbornness. Are you persistent? Yes. Are you stubborn? Yes. You're both of those things. And so to situations and people, if you're around people who value persistence, it's going to look like a strength. And if you're in situations that reward persistence, it's going to look like a strength. But if you're in situations where people value flexibility, changing your mind, pivoting, adjusting, adapting, you're going to look weak, and the people around you are going to, and if you're in situations like that, it's going to make it look like a weakness as well. And so we talk about these things as though they're solid states when they're not. They're a perception that sort of other people have. And so all I'm trying to do is show people that the quality that oftentimes they've been criticized the most for the longest, is also a strength if they could only see that, and then deliberately put themselves in situations that reward them for it, and deliberately put themselves in relationships with people who would reward them for that. A simple example real quick for that is my wife is very fluid in her sense of time, which means she's late a lot and doesn't really take timeliness seriously. And that's something that's taken a long time for me to see the upside for. But she has a massage therapist who's the same way. So when my wife misses a massage, the lady doesn't care. She doesn't penalize her for it. When my wife's late, the lady doesn't get upset. And my wife's massage therapist is likely to also be late, and they might actually get there at the same time, 20 minutes late. And if they need to do it later that day, or they still need to do it later, neither one of them cares about timeliness. And so they're a great fit. Whereas other person would have said, I can't do your massages because you're never on time. Or if my wife really valued timeliness, she would have given up on this massage therapist years ago because the lady's never on time. So that's an example of where they both have fluid and flexible feelings about timeliness and those kinds of things. And so they're both fine in their relationship with each other, and neither has animosity or frustration with the other person. Whereas that person couldn't be my massage therapist for more than one appointment, because that's what an appointment is in my mind, is a blood oath for us to do this at the exact time that we scheduled to do it. And I've got it on my Google Calendar, and I've got a reminder set up, on my phone to set an alarm. I mean, I had an alarm 10 minutes before this call, so I was ready to get ready to be on time and to meet my commitment with you, even though we've never met. I have a blood oath to do this podcast with you in my mind. Right.
It's in the Google Calendar.
Yeah.
I mean, it's there. It's there. You wrote in your book, and it affected me because it happened to me. You write about a teacher who labeled you, and I think a lot of children, whether it's ADHD or just their personality, can get labeled really young. And that happened to me in first grade, and my mom challenged it. Thank God. And I was able to get a different teacher and was able to excel and do great. But it's to this day, I'm 53. To this day, it scares the hell out of me how close of a turn, of a pivot that could have been, but of a pivotal moment.
Yeah.
And you talk about that, and then you go on and you talk about this experiment with, it's pretty famous, but I'd love for you to speak to it, about with brown-eyed children and blue-eyed children in the classroom. Probably could never get away with this experiment in today's age.
No, you absolutely could not. Yeah, sometimes people don't even like you talking about it because of it. Like, hey, we shouldn't. Yeah.
Well, it's important. I mean, this is really important, because it's how people think of themselves, and when they allow someone else to label them with a weakness, how powerful that is. If you could just speak to that experiment, because I it's wow.
Yeah. So it was a little school in Riceville, Iowa, and the teacher, it was Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King had just been assassinated, and it was an all-white school. I always joke it's called Riceville. So it's an all-white school, and she knew they didn't understand racism. They weren't victims of racism. They weren't exposed to anybody who wasn't white, and probably farmers and stuff like that. Everybody was very homogenous where they were from. And so without telling them, she told them a lie. And so she said, I want all the brown-eyed kids to go to one side of the room and all the blue-eyed kids to go to the other side of the room. And then she told him, she said, recent studies have shown that blue-eyed kids are better than brown-eyed kids. And so for the rest of the day, if you were a blue-eyed kid and you raised your hand, she'd call on you. If you're a brown-eyed kid, she'd ignore you. If you were a blue-eyed kid and you did something well, she'd praise you. If you were a brown-eyed kid and you did something well, she'd ignore you, or actually even punish you or criticize you. She gave extra benefits to the blue-eyed kids and was harder on the brown-eyed kids and put a lot of restrictions on them. And basically what she found is by the end of one day, the brown-eyed kids were even talking about themselves as being worse people, and like, yep, she totally got me. I've known this my whole life, and I guess I've always understood this to some extent, and at least somebody's finally put a label to it, and now I at least understand the science behind it. And the blue-eyed kids, meanwhile, were like, yeah, we are pretty fantastic, and we are better. And they started basically mistreating the brown-eyed kids as well, because they were inferior, right? And the next day she came in, and this is the power of relabeling and reframing. She came in the next day and said, oh, I messed it up, kids. I'm sorry. It was actually, I went back and read it overnight. It's actually the brown-eyed kids who are amazing and the blue-eyed kids who are never going to amount to anything. And again, everything went upside down. The blue-eyed kids immediately started feeling like garbage and underestimating themselves and failing to get involved and failing to take the initiative. And the brown-eyed kids were answering every question and were confident and all those kinds of things, and immediately began to persecute the blue-eyed children as they had been persecuted the day before. And so it just shows the power, and I say this in the book, to take a neutral characteristic and assign negative qualities to it, right? Yeah. And I think we've done that just with so many things. Like I said, I spoke at that school for kids with learning differences. That's kids with dyslexia, ADHD, autism. Most people call those learning disabilities. They call them learning differences, and people could argue about that and, oh, you're just trying to soften. No, kids with dyslexia learn. They just learn differently, and we've called it a disability instead of just a unique way to go about it. And people with autism have done all sorts of amazing things in our world, but we want to focus on all the things they can't do and all of the things that aren't there. And Temple Grandin is a great movie about that. A woman with dyslexia who did amazing things and has amazing empathy for animals and an amazing ability to understand things and an amazing ability to communicate things, but she's just not typical. She's not the same as everyone else. And what most people want to do is give her classes on how to have normal interpersonal skills instead of valuing the benefits that she brings to the world. And so I think that's what we've done with just about everything. We love to pathologize things. If you're a little bit organized, you're OCD. If you get a little bit nervous about things, you have anxiety problems. If you acknowledge the negative events in this world, you have depression. And we're also all, and this is something that bothers me as a person who has a master's degree in psychology and an undergrad in psychology and really studied it, everybody's an armchair psychologist. So people also feel completely comfortable diagnosing themselves and others when they have absolutely no idea. You know, OCD, for example, is not about being neat and organized. It's about repetitive behaviors that you can't control and intrusive thoughts that tell you if you don't walk through that doorway again and do it the right way, something terrible is going to happen to you. That's not organized. That's a totally different thing. And yet, you know, if somebody likes things to be neat and organized, they'll call themselves OCD, and other people around them will tell them OCD. And this is crucial. And then tell them to relax. Don't worry about it. Loosen up. You know, fix it, instead of saying, wow, what a great thing that you love things to be neat and organized. And what if you became a professional organizer and joined the National Association of Professional Organizers and built a life around being somebody who's super organized and got paid for doing the thing that you seem to love to do, even if you weren't getting paid for it. So we love to pathologize things. We love to negatively label things. And we're wrong most of the time. And even if the person does have the weakness, they also have the strength, and then we don't see it. We miss it. We miss the upside. And that's all I'm trying to do is say, hey, even if that's true, there's another side of the story. And are you at least acknowledging the whole picture, or are you getting lost in the weakness instead of seeing both parts of the equality?
Dave, why do you think we do that? Because we do that. It is black and white. You're either good or bad.
Yeah.
Either right or wrong.
Yeah. You said philosophy earlier. Some of it's what we've been taught. You know, you hear things like you're only as strong as your weakest link. You got to watch out for your Achilles heel. These are stories that people tell us. There's that person who did everything right in their life, except they drank a little too much. And so, you know what I mean? And so yeah. I think that's a lot of it. I think some of it goes to, I mean, it's big stuff, religion. You know, are people born as good people, or are people born as horrible sinners? You know, do you have to, if you're happy and enjoying what you're doing, does it mean you must be doing something wrong, or does it mean you're on the right track? You know, yeah. Do we trust ourselves, or do we fear ourselves and resist ourselves? Right? Are we in a battle with our internal drives? You know, you tell some people you should just do what you want, and they're like, oh, I should sit around eating Doritos and watching Netflix and somehow I'd be successful. And my answer to that is you don't want to only sit around and eat Doritos and watch Netflix. You probably have a job that you hate and you're trying to get away from it at the end of the day by eating Doritos and watching Netflix, because at least that feels good. If you got a better job that matched your style and your strengths and weaknesses, you'd probably find that wasn't as attractive, and you might actually spend more time doing that job or doing that work or working on building that business of yours, and you'd get natural positive energy. But even that, what is it about the Doritos that you like, the relaxing that you like, what kinds of shows are you watching? I think there's a story in the book about a guy who grew up sneaking into movies and then sneaking from movie to movie all day long. And then he ended up working for George Lucas, making movies because he was obsessed with movies. So even things that seem like negative obsessions we have, there's another story in the book about video games, and guy's wife finally told him, you got to give up the video games because you're an adult now and you have kids. And instead he started writing books with all the cheat codes and the secrets and the Easter eggs inside of video games, and built a successful business, being obsessed with video games and playing them nonstop and constantly, exploring every aspect of the game itself. So even those things that seem like negative impulses also have positive outgrowths. So I'm not telling people to go around and do bad things. But even the impulses we have sometimes to do bad things, if we just directed that in positive ways, it could be useful. We just had the Super Bowl.
Yeah.
If you're aggressive and physically aggressive towards people, that's negative in almost every context except on the football field. And in the UFC mat and in the boxing ring. And we criticize those people when that violence spills over into their personal lives, and we should. But the solution isn't probably for the person just go, don't do it. The solution is probably for the person to find a positive outlet for those, for that drive, and look for ways to do that positively. So I do think there's positive and negative behaviors, but I still think the characteristic that comes from is just neutral. And the only question is, will I use this in a way that benefits others and is positive, or will I use this in a way that's negative and harms others?
Hey everyone, as you know, I don't have any advertisements nor sponsorships on this podcast. My only ask of you, the listener, is that you share this podcast with someone that you know, a friend, a family member, a coworker, or a colleague who may benefit from this information, may benefit from today's guest, from the value that they're sharing with the audience, with you, the listener. When you share this podcast and our audience grows, it allows me to book more and more guests who have a great message, great nuggets of wisdom that you can benefit from, and again, your network can benefit from. So please, right now, push that share button, send it to somebody that you care about, and let's get back to the interview. If I can paraphrase, it's finding what you love, because again, I love the story Doritos and Netflix. Yeah. It's funny. I kind of say the same thing. I say Cheetos and Netflix. There you go. They're going to go home and eat Cheetos and watch Netflix. So whatever snack food they're eating. But it is, what are you watching? How are you appreciating that? And then, but I guess what I would hate for the audience to, because after reading your book, I know this is not what you mean. It's not to sit there and eat Cheetos and watch Netflix. It's to figure out what it is about that you love, and then go figure out how to make money at that and monetize that and contribute to society with that.
Yeah.
Which
absolutely.
Absolutely. Your message.
I'm just saying that's what people say sometimes when you say do what you love. They're like, they reduce down what they love into. Whereas again, if you told somebody, okay, you can do that all day, every day, at some point the Cheetos don't taste as good and they can't find anything on Netflix, and somebody else they can. And then the question is, should you become a movie reviewer or a TV critic? Or again, even in the most ridiculous thing, there's something there. Literally doing nothing is part of what it means to be certain kinds of monks. And you can run silent retreats and you can meditate. There's jobs for, in a sense, doing nothing, complete stillness, and jobs I couldn't do. So again, if someone's like, all I want to do is nothing, you're like, there's a way to get, I don't want to have meetings and talk to people. Fire up your own silent retreat, and again, I couldn't pull that off, but somebody else is like, if I could just have silence for a few weeks, that'd be great,
Yeah. No, you're right. The message is in there.
Yeah.
So another thing in in your book, you actually quote a gentleman, Tom Rath, who is of Gallup organization. And I think this ties in. The reason I bring this up, it ties into what we just talked about, is you can't just sit on your rear and say, hey, the world come to me.
Yeah.
You got to figure it out. And then you got to go take it to the world. But you quote him and he says, you can't be anything you want to be, but you can be more of who you are.
Yeah.
And if you could just expand, because we're always told you could be the next president of the United States. You could be, whatever you want to be. That may not be the case.
Yeah.
That may not be the case.
Yeah. There's so many examples of that, but I'll give one personally. I wanted to play professional football. Like I said, we just had the Super Bowl. I was very athletic. I played flag football. I played peewee football, but I didn't even get out of peewee football into junior high football because I was emaciated. I was so skinny. People it was back in the 80s, and there was a big famine in Ethiopia. The kids would be mean and tease me and call me Ethiopian. I wasn't just a little bit thin. I was grotesquely, unusually skinny. And so I wanted to play football, but I didn't have the body for football. And there's no amount of human growth hormone. There's no amount of steroids that would have turned me into an offensive lineman for the Wisconsin Badgers or the Green Bay Packers, which is what I wanted. And when I graduated from high school, I was 6'4" and 145 pounds. That's a body that most people can't even imagine, and certainly nobody wants. And so when somebody says you can be whatever you want to be, and if you just want it bad enough and you just try hard enough, that's just simply not true. And my body at that time proved it. And somebody says, okay, if you drank enough protein shakes and okay, well, let's say that is possible, then let's keep going. What if I told you my goal in life was to be a jockey and ride a horse to victory in the Kentucky Derby? Height is something we know you can't control, and that you don't get through effort. And at 6'5", and now I'm 6'6", I can never be a successful jockey because even if I'm thin, my body's too big for that horse to carry as quickly as it could a person who was the right size. So, and again, a principle isn't true if there's at least one exception, and that's just one quick exception, and there's just a million of them. And there's some things where we just don't like to acknowledge the realities of things. I mean, last night, one of the people in the Super Bowl was Christian McCaffrey, and his dad won 3 Super Bowls with the Denver Broncos, and then became a coach. Do you think it's helpful to grow up with a person who's your dad who won 3 Super Bowls and then coached football and coached you in football? Do you think that person do you think there's some people who, because of the life that they had, simply don't have the potential to do that because they're just too far behind? You know what I mean? It's just, and McCaffrey's coach is a guy named Kyle Shanahan, whose dad, Mike Shanahan, won 3 Super Bowls with the Denver Broncos. Do you think it helps you become a coach in the NFL if your dad's a coach? So we love to imagine that everyone has the same level of opportunity. And I'm not even talking about access. I'm just talking about, the number one determinant of being a professional athlete is if you had a parent who was a professional athlete. Steph Curry has parents who were both professional athletes. And so to tell somebody, if you're 5'4" and 200 pounds when you're 13, and somebody tells you could be a professional athlete if you just want, it's just not true. And there's example after example after example. There's people who understand physics in a way that you and I never could, even if we had the greatest tutor on earth. We have ways that our brains like to work and don't like to work. We have preferences. So even if I could do it, it doesn't mean I want to do it, and I'd be fulfilled in the same way somebody else would. So I think we demoralize people with the everything is possible message when we're trying to encourage them. Because if everything's really possible, then I'm a failure because I'm not a male model who was also an astronaut, who's also a billionaire, who was also a professional football player. Right. And I should be able to be all of those things because anything is possible. And whatever it is just right at your fingertips. So then when somebody hasn't achieved that, it's tremendously demoralizing and they must have failed in some way.
So that is, with our society, you can be anything you want. As you named off, quarterback, astronaut, all these other things. So I'm a parent. There's a lot of parents that are listening. We want to tell our kids, you can be the next president of the United States. But that really isn't the right thing to tell them in the big picture. So for somebody that does this for a living and you've studied this so much, what there's probably not a right answer, David. What is the best answer? What is the best approach? Because you want to be encouraging, but you're right. If you're 5'3" and you're 200 pounds, you're probably not going to be, a star quarterback unless you make a lot of life changes and get a growth spurt.
Yeah. And those are the growth spurts beyond your control, right? So that's, again, we like to act like we control things that we don't. I mean, there's a great book called The Sports Gene, and he looks at a lot of stuff. David Epstein, he looks at a lot of stuff, and one of them is speed. And they do a lot of work on soccer in European countries, and they call it football. And what they found is you can make people faster with effort, but someone who's fast will get even faster, and someone who's slow will never be fast. They'll just be faster than how slow they were. You don't turn a slow person into a fast person. And so what we need to tell children is understand yourself and what you're working with, and then find situations that reward you for who you are instead of punishing you for who you are. Right? That's it. There's a million situations. I work for myself because I'm unemployable, not because I'm better than people who work at jobs. I'm not good in corporate situations. I'm not good at doing what I'm told. I'm not good at following the rules. I'm not good at group activities. I get a little upset when I watch a group activity happening. My daughter and I were watching Lego Masters, and they work in teams of 2, and they're friends, and they're on a team, and I get that. I could do that. But then one time they're like, today's episode is going to be 4 teams together against 4 other teams together. And my daughter and I both looked at each other and were like, nah, no.
That's great.
I only want to be judged on what I do, not what you do while you're working for me. Yeah. And so it's a lie to tell people that they can be anything they want to be. And it's a demoralizing lie because they're going to spend their life beating themselves up if they don't then become everything. By definition, everyone can't make it into Harvard, or it stops being Harvard. And people have so many different kinds of things to offer than Harvard even manages to reward. And so that's what it comes down to is, who are you? What do you like? What are you good at? And then what do you do with that? How do you put yourself in situations that put the spotlight on the best things about you and take the spotlight off of the things that you don't have? So I'll give you an example of a parent doing this well. And I like the way you said your mom fought against it in first grade. My parents didn't. They added on to it. So, for example, in 8th grade, they gave the school permission to physically hit me with a fraternity bat, spanking. In 8th grade, first of all, corporal punishment doesn't do much once you're, and there's far more powerful punishments at that point, grounding, whatever. But even that, there's nothing to be punished for, but for talking too much and not sitting still and all those kinds of things. So I got the same message from everybody. So I didn't even have the possibility to discover, right? So one lady I was speaking to one time in Missouri, and she was from the St. Louis area. And she's constantly being called into the school because her kids talks too much, and they just want to talk to her like this is the most serious problem on earth. And finally, one time she said, she just slammed her hand down in the middle of a meeting with these teachers and administrators and said, maybe he's going to be a talk show host. Let's move on. And so I think that's our job as parents, is to help kids see, how do you use this in a positive way, and how do you move away from out of situations. So, for example, if our kids are constantly banging around the house and potentially going to be breaking things, we love to say, calm down, sit still, instead of saying, let's go to the park. And if a kid's really hyper, let's get you involved in karate. Let's get you involved in sports. I always love to say with hyperactive kids, no coach has ever sent a kid home from practice and complained about how hyperactive your child was. But teachers do it all the time. So it's not the kid, it's the situation. So I think our job as parents, it's not just what we tell them, it's also what we do. Do we seek out those situations? Your kid's argumentative, get involved in debate. Your kid's dramatic. We love to say, save your drama for your mama, but mama doesn't want it either. But there's actually a class in high school called drama. And yet we don't think of that as an outlet for a dramatic person. And yet how many of us want to watch a play where the person won't play the part and won't be dramatic? They just want to play it. That's not why you go to drama. Nobody wants to see an actor who isn't acting, right? Yep. So I think that's our job as parents, is to help kids understand that there are limits, and we need to know what those limits are. Because you're not good at this, then you should try to do that. A simple example for people who think that sounds demoralizing is, I think most people over 20 years have seen American Idol at least once. If you're alive,
Sure.
you've seen it, and you've seen a clip even on TikTok or Instagram or somewhere. And what's tough to watch on American Idol, and they love to show it for this reason, is the person who loves singing and loves music and yet doesn't understand that they're terrible at singing and have no sense of how music works. And so that's what we're talking about. Telling that person they have the same potential as a 4.5-year-old who has perfect pitch, who's always been able to stay on beat, who taps on the wall and on their legs like some of the greatest drummers on earth. To act as though those two people have the same musical potential just isn't true. Now, could that one person become better at it? Sure. Could they go from being terrible to being average? Sure. But is that ever gonna? No. So to tell that person that they have the same potential, or that they could if they just tried, it's just not true. Now, does the person with natural talent and ability need to work on it and things like that? Absolutely. I was 6'6", and the way I paid for college was through basketball. And that meant I practiced all the time. I didn't say I'm tall, so it's mine. I had to do something with that. But I didn't try to become a jockey. I stopped playing soccer, where the reward is for quickness and speed instead of for height and jumping ability and things like that. But if I was going to play soccer, I should have been a goalie, because goalies are tall and have leaping ability and long arms and those kinds of things. So again, it's about getting that kid to see the importance of understanding who they are, and then finding situations, extracurricular activities, majors in college, classes in high school that fit who they are and that constantly reward them. I did an event, or I did a family retreat, which was super cool, where a mom and dad and their 2 kids did the freak factor assessment, and we talked through the concepts with their young kids. And their son had all these weaknesses of not wanting to, wanting to be in charge and not wanting to be told what to do, and wanting to be the center of attention and being competitive. And it turned, and not wanting to be cooperative and interact effectively with other people. And he played soccer, and it turned out he was the goalie who works independently on their own, doesn't interact in the same way as everybody else. He was a soccer referee on the side. Like, he also refereed games where he got to be the boss. Even though he's 14 years old, he got to kick parents out and tell people. He had all these situations, even as a child, where he was in the right spot. And he was choosing roles even in situations that we might naturally be in that fit his, but it was all related to characteristics the parents otherwise would have said, those are some pretty negative qualities. And we wish he'd be more cooperative, and we wish he'd listen more, and we wish but then when we looked at his actual activities, he was finding situations that rewarded him for those unique qualities and that noticed the upside instead of penalizing him for the downside. So it's understanding yourself and then finding that alignment. That's really the key that we have to do as parents.
And so the logical follow-up question to that is, because I agree with everything you've said. What I'm struggling in my own mind is, okay, but there are also times when my kids would just, and they're 23 and 20 now, but when they would just misbehave, and,
Sure.
and they weren't the wrong person in the right, they were just not so how, man, that's a fine line to walk, David. Like, how do we know when that's just not appropriate behavior versus, well, they're in the wrong place as the wrong, for their skill sets?
Misbehavior is a loaded thing, because as soon as you tell your kids something's wrong, if they do it, now they've been disobedient, so that's misbehavior. Who defines it, right? Who defines what misbehavior is, right? So I mean, people are like, oh, you're certainly not saying to do drugs, you're certainly not saying to break the law. Well, there's actually a research study that shows that people who start their own businesses as adults probably were moderate lawbreakers as young people. I'm not talking about murderers and rapists, but they probably vandalized. They probably drove too fast. They probably, broke some rules. They probably trespassed. They probably skipped class. They probably did. They're boundary pushers, right? But more famously, Gandhi went to jail on purpose and consistently. Martin Luther went to jail on purpose and consistently, because some rules are wrong, some laws are wrong, some guidelines are inappropriate. and oppressive. And misbehavior is a tough one because, again, oftentimes it is just a simple matter of the wrong fit. The kid's tired of sitting in the car because they're very active. They're tired of doing what they're told because they have goals of their own. They're tired of, and even things like that we call misbehavior, having a messy room. There's a whole book called Messy, The Power of Disorder to Transform Our Lives. And there's plenty of evidence that messy people are tremendously creative and that there's nothing technically wrong with being messy. It's just a preference that we have, that some people have for cleanliness. And then we make that a standard at our house or at our company, clean desk policy. And now you're in breach because you don't have a clean desk and we don't value the other side of the equation. So I think we have the right as parents. Here's a phrase I try to teach parents. And again, I'm a parent. I have a 22-year-old, a 20-year-old, and a 17-year-old. I'm not talking as a person who's never experienced any of these things. But I think it's a challenge to myself as well. I think what we need to learn to say is, I don't like it, but it's not wrong. I wish my kid would sit still, but they have a lot of energy and I need to give them that opportunity. I wish they'd be quiet, but they have a lot to say, and there's nothing wrong with that. I wish they'd do what I told them to, but they have a lot of questions, and they like to have agency and control over their life, and so I have to interact with them more about it than I'd prefer. I wish they loved school, but they don't, and so I need to adjust to the person I have instead of the person that I wish they were. And so I do think that a lot of the things we call misbehaviors are simply preferences we have over the way we'd like people to be. And then we turn that into a moral or ethical thing. And then we criticize people for not doing things the way that we want. But even if, so let's go all the way and let's even say it is technically misbehavior. Again, I think there's a way to handle that too, where we don't talk about who the person is, but simply what they're doing. But also explain it in terms of our preferences. So let's say it isn't even misbehavior, but you're tired of it. You can say, I'm a person who likes peace and quiet, and I know that's not perfect, but I don't like a lot of noise and chaos. And so I'd really appreciate it if you could calm down. You're starting to treat them like we treat real people. Like, hey, if now that you know that this is something that people around you, you're in the airport and someone's watching a video on full blast and doesn't seem to know that headphones were invented 1,000 years ago, right? Well, ideally, when that person knows that, they change it, but oftentimes, but then we write the book, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck, and then we complain when people don't do what we want in public. Well, we told people there's also tremendous power in deciding you don't care what everybody around you thinks. And if you're happy watching your show, they should put in their headphones and stop paying attention to it, right? So is it good to not give a fuck? Yeah. Is it problematic to not give a fuck? Yeah. And so really the advice I would give is you don't need to become that person. If you are that person, there's a way to take advantage of that and take jobs where you're a referee, for example, and you have to have a thick skin and not be super concerned about what people think about you. But if you're not, don't try to develop that, because it's good to be a person who cares what the people around you think and who isn't constantly bothering and irritating the people around you and who has some sense of thoughtfulness and care. But again, that's not perfect either, because if you live your life trying to make everybody happy, that's a tremendously problematic way to do things as well. But if that's who you are, again, you can find roles and situations where you can have a happy and good life by pleasing and serving and helping the people around you, because you get genuine pleasure from that. But then we're going to call you a people pleaser and tell you that's a terrible thing and that you need to turn it around. And that's part of what I'm trying to show is this is all a catch-22. The normal way of dealing with people's strengths and weaknesses is a catch-22, because no matter what you do, someone wants you to change something, somebody wants you to fix something, somebody wants you to turn something up, somebody else wants you to dial it back. I mean, just yesterday, I was parking at my daughter's swim meet, and I went kind of away from where all the other cars were and just thought I'd park in a more open area just for ease of parking. And we were in no hurry. And they were like, oh my gosh, we're parking so far away. So I pulled back towards all the other cars and I park right in between two cars. And they go, whoa, these two cars are pretty close together. And I don't even know. I said, you can't have it both ways. If you want me to be close to everybody else, we're going to have to jam it into a spot where there's hardly any space. And if you're willing to deal with, walking 10 extra steps, we can pull a little farther away. So we put that catch-22 on people, and then we wonder why they're frustrated and unsuccessful and unfulfilled, and start to get hopeless. And that's part of what I'm trying to help people break out of is there's no perfect way to do it. There's no right way to do it. And we're all kind of figuring it out together.
Yeah. Let me finish with a couple of questions here that I'm already fascinated with how you may answer this. So you've had this this realization, this epiphany, and you really turned it into a living, and you share it with so many people now. So if we were to fast forward to the end of your life, and you've lived this very rich and wonderful life, and there's a loved one that's reading your eulogy, based on everything you've shared today and how you view the human condition today, what three words would you hope, if they could only choose three descriptors to describe your life, the life you led, what three words do you hope they choose to describe you and the life that you led?
Yeah, that's a good question. I might get to the three words, but I'll say something else first, maybe because I'm bad at doing what I'm told. But I end my speeches with a quote that I feel like sums up what I'm trying to accomplish, sums up my mission in life. And it's from E. Cummings. He said, "We do not believe in ourselves until someone reveals that deep inside of us, something is valuable, worth listening to, worthy of our trust, sacred to our touch." And so what I encourage people to do is become a person who reveals to other people that deep inside of them something is valuable instead of worthless. And I try to show that to people and then encourage them to do that for others. The three words, I think for me, one absolutely would be generous, generous or generosity. That's part of the helping people. I spend a lot of time and energy trying to and use a lot of my resources to help and support people who are in circumstances that are difficult, and give them, an opportunity to have success when they live in an environment through no fault of their own. For example, there's a charity I love called Kiva, which does microloans to entrepreneurs all over the world. And you're technically not giving them money, you're donating it, but then I just take the loan when they repay it and I loan it to somebody else and loan it to somebody else. And over the course of years, I've taken about $8,000 and turned it into about $28,000 of loans, because we just keep funneling the same money back. And it helps somebody in a different way than a donation, because it gives them the money to get an education, or gives them the money to get a house, or gives them the money usually to fund their business, which then allows them to make money, pay off the loan, and then keep making money. But generosity, that's just one of them. That generosity is, I think, a big one. Broadly speaking, I don't know what the right name for it is, but probably motivation that I encouraged. Probably that would be the way to say it. Maybe is encouragement, right? That I there's a lady who I spoke to years and years ago at a table at an event, and I encouraged her to start her own speaking business, and I answered a bunch of questions about the freak factor. And I met her years later, and she said, "Oh, I just want to say thanks real quick. You helped me get my dream job as a professional speaker. My relationship with my husband is better because I understand your concept, and now I'm a better mom to my two children. So just a quick thank you. All you've done is just completely transform my life." And so that's success to me, right? That's success to me, is that I didn't tell her, "Well, you probably can't," or I didn't discourage her. I think there's a lot of that going on in the world, but I also didn't encourage like I said, in an uninformed, ridiculous way. I helped her to become who she was made to be. She's in the right spot, and she's accepting and appreciating other people for who they are, and instead of expecting them to be someone else. So generosity and encouragement. And I guess the last one's two words. There's probably a way to do it that isn't two words, but like role model. Like I don't tell people to find their freak factor, and I don't find my own. I don't tell people to do their own thing, and I'm not doing my own thing. I don't tell people to be fit, and I'm not. Like, I do Ironman triathlons, and I've run 100 miles, and I prioritized my kids, and I built a business, and I try to be helpful and caring to other people. I'm trying to do the things that I'm asking people to do. I feel a strong sense of responsibility to, so maybe that's the last one, and maybe that's part of encouragement and generosity, but I guess maybe loving, that I invested in other people. I tried to, live for others, or, I guess maybe that's some generosity, encouragement.
Well, walk the talk. The last one I heard was walk the talk,
Yeah.
All right. Most important question. How can people follow you, connect with you, be part of your journey, be
Yeah.
part of
Yeah.
this?
All this stuff's on drendall.com. So DRENDALL.com. DavidRendell.com's been taken for 20 plus years, and whoever has it never uses it, but they also never give it up. So I'm accidentally Dr. Endall. Back in the day, you would put your first initial before your last name, and that would be your email. So I did that with and then somebody was like, why are you doing euthanasia services or assisted suicide, Dr. Endall? And that is not the case, but unfortunately that's what it is. So DRENDALL.com. All my social stuff is linked there. And also there's videos for the Freak Factor talk. There's assessments for the Freak Factor. There's the kids book on video. There's Pink Goldfish, which is the marketing and strategy version of this. And that's part of an answer to your question about parents. The kids book has a parenting chapter. It has an assessment for kids, so you can see how their strengths and weaknesses are connected. Because if we can't reframe that, then we don't know where to help them go. So tons of free stuff there. The kids book is on Amazon, but it's free on video so that kids who can't read it can watch it, and kids who couldn't afford to buy it can watch it. And so drendall.com is where it all lives. I'm on Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook. I watch TikToks, but I don't make them yet. Sure. That's where you can find me.
We'll put that in the show notes, so people can just click right on that one. Yeah, fantastic. David, thank you for taking the time, and this has been great. It's you hold these two positions juxtaposed to each other. For me, in my mind, they're kind of juxtaposed, but yet beautifully intertwined. From letting people be who they have the potential to be, yet don't falsely tell people, you can be anything you want to be. And it's an interesting position to hold, especially in today's world. And I appreciate your take on that.
Yeah, like I said, I do Ironmans, and one of the things they say that I think is stupid is nothing is impossible. And it's like, nobody's ever going to do an Ironman in 5.5 minutes. It takes hours, and it's just, no one's ever going to jump off the earth at their own power and fly up to the sun, and swim around in the sun and then come back, because their body can't handle that heat, and we don't have that kind of jump. Millions of things are impossible. It's stupid to say. And it's also secretly demoralizing. I don't want people to forget that. And there's a section in the book called Limitations Are Liberating. If it was true that everything was possible, then you're terrible because you haven't done it all, and it's seems like maybe a nuance, but it's not. And so we think
words are powerful.
We're encouraging our kids, and then we can't understand why they're demoralized. And it's because they think they could have got that scholarship if they just would have tried harder, or they could have done well in physics if they just would have put more effort into it, or they could be on American Idol if they just would have played the guitar a little bit more. And then they're missing things that they could or should be because they're focused on these things that they think they could accomplish. So I think that's really crucial, and it's a nuance that people miss in their attempt to encourage people sometimes.
Yeah. No, well said, and well done.
Yeah, thanks, man.
Thank you so much I appreciate you joining. Thank you. Thank you for tuning in to the ThriveMore podcast. Don't forget to take a look at the show notes for any of the resources that we mentioned during the podcast. And if you haven't already, be sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on your notifications so you have access to the latest and the greatest. You can connect with me on any of the socials at Real Roger Martin. And be sure to check out our website, ThriveMoreBrands.com. There you'll find information on the brands we support and information on franchising. Thanks again for tuning in.